Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Um, Today we're looking into something a little different, a little unexpected when it comes to environmental inequity, kind of a twist.
Yeah, definitely.
We're going to Baltimore, Maryland, a city that really challenges our usual assumptions about who bears the burden when it comes to, living near polluting industries.
Absolutely. And, you probably heard that minority communities are often located closest to, these toxic facilities.
Right.
But Baltimore kind of flips that idea on its head, and that's what I think makes it so fascinating.
Exactly. And that's why we're diving into it today. Our main guide for this deep dive is a research paper by Christopher G. Boone
Okay.
called An Assessment and Explanation of Environmental Inequity in Baltimore. It's published in Urban Geography, which is a pretty well-regarded academic journal, so we know the research is solid.
Yeah, definitely. And the paper tackles a really intriguing question.
Okay.
Why are predominantly white communities in Baltimore more likely to be living near TRI
Oh,
facilities?
hold on. TRI facilities. Can you remind us what those are?
Of course. TRI stands for Toxic Release Inventory,
Mm.
and it refers to industrial sites that are required to report releases of certain toxic chemicals,
Hmm.
whether into the air, water, or even onto the land.
Okay.
Now, it's not a perfect measure of risk,
Right.
but let's be honest, you probably wouldn't want to live next to one.
Definitely not. So if TRI facilities are generally considered undesirable,
Right.
and if we're talking about environmental inequity, we would usually expect to see them located near, well, communities that have historically faced, disadvantages.
Yeah,
But
you would think so.
yeah,
And in many cases, that is the pattern.
right.
But Baltimore kind of throws us a curveball.
Okay, so what did Boone find in Baltimore that's so different?
Well, picture this, a map of Baltimore with all the TRI sites marked.
Right.
That's actually figure 1 in Boone's paper,
Okay.
and it's quite revealing. What you see is the highest concentration of these facilities smack dab in the middle of predominantly white census tracts.
Wait, so more white communities are living closer to these industrial sites? How does that even make sense?
That's the million-dollar question. And Boone dug deep into the data to find answers.
Yeah.
He found that more white residents, both in sheer numbers and as a proportion of the population, live in census tracts with TRI facilities.
Wow.
And get this, when he analyzed census tracts race was the most significant factor connected to TRI proximity, even more so than income or education.
That's really surprising. You're telling me that being white is a bigger factor than being poor or less educated when it comes to living near these facilities. It feels like we're turning the usual narrative completely upside down.
It does, doesn't it? And to make it even more compelling, this pattern wasn't just a quirk of looking at census tracts.
Okay.
Boone found the same pattern when he zoomed in looking at smaller areas like block groups and even areas within a quarter-mile or half-mile radius of a TRI site.
So this isn't just a statistical fluke. There's a real pattern here.
Yeah.
But how do we explain it? It seems so counterintuitive.
To understand this, we need to look at the historical context. You can't truly grasp Baltimore's unique environmental puzzle without understanding its long history of residential segregation.
So this is where history comes in.
Yeah.
It's not just about where these facilities are located today. It's about how Baltimore developed over time.
Exactly. Imagine Baltimore in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Okay.
Industrialization is booming, the city's growing rapidly. But this growth is happening alongside policies and practices that discriminate against Black residents, shaping where they could live.
So we're talking about that era of Jim Crow laws, segregation, all those forces that systematically disadvantaged Black communities and kept them confined to certain areas.
Precisely. In Baltimore, this played out through things like restrictive covenants that prevented Black residents from buying homes in certain areas,
Right.
and lending practices that made it almost impossible for them to get mortgages. There was even a segregation ordinance in 1910 that, while later overturned, still cast a long shadow over the city.
So Black residents were essentially pushed into specific neighborhoods, often lacking resources and opportunities. And I'm guessing this segregation wasn't just about where people lived. It probably also impacted where industries were allowed to set up shop, right?
You're absolutely on the right track. This historical segregation played a huge role in shaping Baltimore's industrial landscape, and with it, the environmental burdens that came along.
So maybe these polluting industries weren't intentionally choosing to avoid Black neighborhoods, but maybe they were drawn to areas that were already zoned for industrial use, and those areas happened to be predominantly white because of decades of segregation.
That's a key insight. It wasn't necessarily some deliberate plan to burden white communities. It's more that past choices like zoning decisions can have a ripple effect over time. And these effects often play out along racial and economic lines.
Okay, that's starting to make more sense.
Okay.
So it's not about some evil plot, but more about the unintended consequences of historical patterns.
Right. During the 1920s and 1930s, the city implemented industrial zoning, which further cemented this separation. Industries were naturally drawn to places with easy access to the harbor, railroad lines, and highways. These were the lifelines of industry back then.
Makes sense.
Trap.
Those are the hubs of transportation and commerce.
Exactly. And guess where those hubs and industrial zones were often located?
Okay.
In areas that were already home to white working class communities.
Okay.
This is where things get really interesting. Remember, we're talking about a time when housing discrimination was rampant.
Right.
So many Black residents simply didn't have the option of living in these areas, even if they wanted to.
So the industries weren't necessarily targeting white communities. They were just following the path of least resistance, going where the land was zoned for their use and where they could find workers.
Precisely. But because of the history of segregation, those areas happen to be predominantly white. And that's a big part of how we ended up with this seemingly counterintuitive environmental inequity pattern in Baltimore today, where it's actually white communities bearing a disproportionate burden of living near these TRI sites.
Wow. It's amazing how these seemingly separate issues, housing industry, environmental justice, are all intertwined.
It really highlights the complexity of these problems, and it shows how historical injustices can have lasting consequences, even in ways that we might not expect.
This is definitely making me rethink some of my assumptions about environmental inequity.
Yeah,
It's a reminder that these issues are rarely simple or straightforward.
absolutely. And to bring this all back to a human level, remember, Boone mentions the neighborhood of Wagner's Point at the beginning of his paper.
Oh, right, the one he describes as almost a ghost town. Just a handful of residents holding on, despite being surrounded by petrochemical plants.
Yes, it's a stark reminder that these aren't just statistics on a map.
Right.
We're talking about real people living with the legacy of these historical processes.
And the fact that Wagner's Point was, and still is, predominantly white, just drives home the point that Baltimore's story is much more complicated than it first appears. It really does challenge the conventional wisdom about who bears the burden of environmental hazards.
It does, and it raises a lot of questions about how we define and address environmental inequity.
This is also fascinating. I'm really starting to understand how historical forces can create these unexpected patterns of inequity, even when overt discrimination might not be the primary driving factor.
That's a crucial point. We often think of environmental injustice as a clear-cut case of minority communities being intentionally targeted. But Baltimore shows us that it can be much more subtle and nuanced than that. It's about understanding the interconnectedness of historical forces, economic development, and social policies.
It seems like there's still so much to unpack here. This is a real deep dive in every sense of the word.
It is, and I think it's a perfect example of why we need to dig deeper, challenge our assumptions, and really grapple with the complexity of these issues.
Well, this has definitely given me a lot to think about. What else did Boone find in his research? I'm ready to dive even deeper.
Yeah, there's a lot more to uncover here.
Yeah.
One of the things Boone did was delve into the specific types of industries found in these predominantly white areas with TRI facilities. And it turns out many of them were tied to Baltimore's, industrial history, particularly its role as a major port city.
Oh, that makes sense. We were talking earlier about how industries were drawn to areas with access to transportation hubs like the harbor.
Exactly. And Baltimore's harbor was a hub for all sorts of industries, shipbuilding, manufacturing, chemical production.
Right.
These industries often required large tracts of land, and they generated a lot of waste,
Yeah.
some of it toxic.
So it sounds like these historically white working class communities ended up living near the industries that were really driving Baltimore's economy.
That's a key part of the story. And it's important to remember that back then, environmental regulations were much weaker than they are today.
Right.
So these industries were often releasing pollutants directly into the air, water, and soil with few consequences.
That's pretty alarming to think about. Like the environmental costs were just accepted as part of doing business.
Unfortunately, that was often the case. And the people who lived in these communities, many of them working-class white families, had little power to challenge these industries or demand better environmental protections.
That's a good point. It's not just about race, it's also about class and political power.
Right.
These communities were essentially stuck with the pollution because they didn't have the resources or influence to fight back.
Exactly. And this highlights another layer of complexity in Baltimore's environmental inequity story. Even within the white community, there were disparities based on socioeconomic status.
Okay.
The wealthier residents could often afford to move away from these industrial areas, while the poorer residents were left behind to deal with the pollution.
So even within the group that's statistically more likely to live near TRI facilities in Baltimore white residents, there are still differences based on income and social class. It's like a microcosm of the broader issue of environmental inequity.
Precisely. And this brings us back to the question of how we define and measure environmental inequity. It's not just about proximity to pollution. It's about understanding the historical context, the power dynamics, and the socioeconomic factors that create vulnerability and disadvantage.
It sounds like Baltimore's case is a powerful reminder that environmental justice isn't just about race, it's also about class power and the historical legacy of industrial development.
Absolutely. And it challenges us to think more broadly about how we address these issues. We can't just focus on cleaning up polluted neighborhoods. We need to understand the root causes of environmental inequity and work to dismantle the systems that perpetuate it.
That makes a lot of sense. But I'm also wondering if Baltimore's pattern is an exception. What does that tell us about other cities? Is it always about race, or are there other factors at play?
That's a great question. And it's one that researchers are still trying to answer. We need more studies that look at the intersection of race, class, and environmental hazards in different cities. But Baltimore's case shows us that we can't make assumptions. We have to dig deeper and be willing to challenge our own preconceived notions.
It feels like we're only scratching the surface of a really complex issue here.
Mhm.
What are some of the key things we can learn from Baltimore's unique situation?
One of the biggest takeaways for me is that environmental justice isn't just about cleaning up pollution hotspots.
Right.
It's about addressing the underlying social and economic inequalities that make certain communities more vulnerable to environmental hazards in the first place.
So it's not just about the environment, it's about social justice as well.
Exactly. It's about creating a world where everyone has equal access to a clean and healthy environment, regardless of their race, income, or zip code.
That sounds like a pretty big goal. How do we even begin to tackle something like that?
Yeah. It's definitely a complex challenge, but there are things we can do. One important step is to promote equitable development policies that prioritize the needs of communities that have been historically marginalized.
Okay.
We need to make sure that new industries are located in a way that doesn't disproportionately burden low-income communities or communities of color.
So it's about planning with environmental justice in mind, not just focusing on economic growth at all costs.
Exactly. And it's also about ensuring that communities have a voice in the decision-making process.
Boy.
We can't just have experts and policymakers dictating solutions from on high. We need to engage directly with the people who are most impacted by environmental problems and give them a seat at the table.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about empowering communities to advocate for themselves and have a say in their own future.
Right, and it's about holding industries accountable for their environmental impacts.
Uh-huh.
We need strong regulations and enforcement mechanisms to ensure that companies aren't cutting corners or putting profits ahead of public health.
So it's a multifaceted approach that involves government policies, community engagement, and corporate responsibility.
Absolutely. It's going to take a lot of work from all sectors of society to create a more just and equitable environmental future.
This is giving me a lot to think about in terms of how we can all play a part in pushing for change. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I'm curious to hear more about what Boone specifically recommends based on his findings in Baltimore. What are some concrete steps that can be taken to address the legacy of environmental inequity in that city?
You know, it's fascinating how Baltimore challenges our preconceived notions about environmental injustice. It's not always a simple story of minority communities being targeted, and that complexity makes finding solutions even more crucial.
It does. Boone's research really highlights the need for tailored solutions that address Baltimore's unique historical context. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
So what does Boone suggest? What are some concrete steps to address the legacy of environmental inequity in Baltimore? Well, one of his key recommendations is to focus on community revitalization efforts in those predominantly white neighborhoods that have been burdened with industrial pollution for decades.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
We can't just ignore these communities because they don't fit the traditional narrative of environmental injustice.
Exactly. These communities have faced real hardships, and they deserve support and investment to improve their quality of life and environmental health.
So what would that look like in practice? What kind of revitalization efforts are we talking about?
Well, Boone suggests a range of strategies, including things like brownfield remediation,
Okay.
which means cleaning up contaminated industrial sites and redeveloping them for community use.
That sounds like a great way to address both the environmental and economic challenges these communities face. You could turn those blighted industrial areas into parks, green spaces, or even affordable housing.
Right. And it's not just about physical improvements.
Yeah.
Boone also emphasizes the need for economic development initiatives that create job opportunities for residents in these communities.
So it's about creating a more sustainable and equitable future for these communities, not just cleaning up the mess of the past.
Precisely. And it's about ensuring that these communities have access to the resources and support they need to advocate for themselves and shape their own future.
This whole deep dive has been so insightful. It's really made me think differently about environmental justice and how complex these issues can be.
I agree. Baltimore's case really underscores the need for nuanced and context-specific approaches to environmental justice. We can't rely on simple solutions or assumptions.
It's about understanding the interconnectedness of history, economics, and social policy. And it's about recognizing that environmental justice isn't just about race. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to live a healthy and thriving environment.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a fight worth having and one that requires us to challenge our assumptions, dig deeper, and work together to create a more just and equitable future for all.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into Baltimore's environmental inequity. We hope this has sparked your curiosity and giving you some new perspectives to consider. If you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to check out Boone's full research paper, which we've linked in the show notes. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep asking questions and keep diving deep.